Welcome to Video 7. At the end of the previous video, I raised a question. If Paul is not managing Genesis 3, and if power is not the category organizing his thought, then what does that mean for hierarchical complementarianism? This video is the answer to that question for me. This video is titled, Why I Am No Longer a Hierarchical Complementarian. At this point in the series, I need to be clear about what this video is and what it is not. This is not a story about switching teams in a debate, and it is not an attempt to distance myself from people. It is about recognizing that one of the dominant frameworks Christians use to read Paul is asking the wrong kind of question. For a long time, I was content to describe myself as a complementarian. But after reading Paul closely and taking him at his word, it became clear to me that hierarchical complementarianism, even in its careful forms, does not adequately describe what Paul is actually doing in his letters. Here's why. Hierarchical complementarianism usually begins with a sober and realistic observation. Human relationships are broken. Domination is a genuine danger. Power can be abused. All of that is true. But then a decisive assumption is made. Domination is treated as inevitable. And the theological task becomes, how can Christian order be maintained within that condition? That assumption does a lot of work. Once domination is accepted as unavoidable, authority becomes necessary. Structure becomes protective. Hierarchy becomes a safeguard. Order is now something that must be enforced rather than expressed. This is why it is fair to say, hierarchical complementarianism often assumes that, because sin distorts relationships, authority is necessary to preserve order. But the logic does not stop there. Because hierarchical complementarianism also reads hierarchy into Genesis 2, hierarchy becomes not only a post-fall safeguard, but a pre-fall structure as well. In other words, hierarchy is treated as necessary, both before the fall and after the fall, to maintain order. That is a very strong claim, and it is precisely where the problem lies, because that is not how Paul reasons. Paul does not assume that relational order depends on power. In Genesis 2, order exists without hierarchy, difference exists without domination, direction exists without control. That is Paul's starting point, not Genesis 3. Hierarchical complementarianism often says, yes, but the fall hasn't gone away. Paul agrees with that. The fall has not disappeared. But Paul does not agree that the fall still governs Christian relationships. Paul believes Christ has judged domination itself. That does not mean abuse becomes impossible, but it does mean domination is no longer legitimate. And that distinction matters. Paul does not rehabilitate authority as a management tool. He bypasses it. When Paul addresses husbands, he does not tell them to rule well or exercise leadership carefully. He tells them to love, self-giving, costly love shaped by the cross. When Paul addresses wives, he does not command obedience. He speaks of reverent response. When Paul speaks about submission, he does not weaponize it as an action imposed on one group. He names it as a shared posture under Christ. That is not hierarchy with gentler language. It is a different grammar altogether. Once you see that Paul is not managing Genesis 3, but restoring Genesis 2 through Christ, Hierarchical complementarianism begins to feel like it is answering a question Paul has rejected. Hierarchical complementarianism is operating one level downstream, inside a framework Paul does not use. And that is why I no longer describe myself as a hierarchical complementarian. Not because I have rejected order, but because I have rejected the idea that order depends on hierarchy. In the next video, I want to explain why leaving hierarchy behind does not mean embracing egalitarianism either, and why that framework fails in a different but equally important way.